Good day, everybody. This is going to be Lecture 2 from Chapter 11 in the Ways of the World textbook called Worlds of Islam, 600 to 1500 CE. So this is the next chapter in the post-classical era. So here we go. In Lecture 2, we're going to talk about the spread of Islam outside of the Caliphate. The Caliphate was the empire that had been created by the Caliphs, the successors of Islam, who became sort of Islamic emperors. But we're going to see that the Caliphate fell apart in the first lecture, and Islam continues to spread through other means. Then we're going to talk about how Islam became its own sort of network of exchange across Afro-Eurasia. So, here we go. Now remember, the word Dar al-Islam, or the phrase Dar al-Islam, means the house of Islam. And this refers to essentially all of the areas within Afro-Eurasia where Islam spread. It didn't necessarily become the majority religion in all of these places, but it appeared. There were diasporic communities of merchants, some rulers became Islamic. So even outside of the sort of heartland of Islam, the Middle East and North Africa, it continued to spread, and Dar al-Islam is kind of similar to the phrase Christendom out in the West, where even if you were in France or the Byzantine Empire or Germany, there was a sense that there was a thing that sort of bound those people together, and that was Christianity. In Dar al-Islam, the thing that sort of binds people together is Islam, the submission to the one God as the basis for their religion and culture. So, now, Islam had kind of a special relationship with merchants, because number one, Muhammad himself was a merchant. So he sort of brought that background to the founding of the religion. And so many of the early Arab followers who traded across the Arabian Peninsula were also merchants. So you're going to see that early on, Islam will develop a great deal of respect for merchant activity, commercial activity, and allowances for it. And basically in the Quran, as long as you're being honest, as long as you're not cheating people or taking like too much profit and not giving it to charity and stuff like that, then merchant activity is okay. And it's okay to go and trade and move around bringing goods with you. So you're going to see that as Islam spreads, to some extent merchant activity will increase. This will be a way that actually sort of intensifies trade across Afro-Eurasia, the spread of Islam. And you're going to see that around Dar al-Islam, in the various cities around the Indian Ocean, even in China, in Africa, West Africa and East Africa, there will be big diasporic communities of Muslim merchants, some of whom came from the heartland, like the Arabian Peninsula, and settled in a place like Malacca, some of whom were, natives to the region who converted to Islam and then sort of gravitated toward this growing community. And you're going to see that, once again, kind of like the influence that China had on the rest of East Asia, these other societies around China wanted to engage in the tribute system and gain access to Chinese civilization in order to increase their ability to trade there. So Islam has kind of the same impact, where even outside of the core of Islam, outside of the Caliphate, people want to start joining the religion in order to kind of access this growing network. There was the sense that Islam was this thing that was getting bigger. Now, the language that becomes the standard language of trade and merchant activity and scholarship across most of Dar al-Islam is some form of Arabic. And as it spreads out of the Middle East, Arabic will transform into a number of different dialects, so slightly different versions of Arabic. But everywhere you go across Dar al-Islam, Arabic will be used by merchants. Now, Persia is one of the big exceptions to this. The Persian language remains predominant there, but they still do engage very actively in trade with other parts of Dar al-Islam. Now, the Arabic written language, though, the writing system and alphabet, this will also spread widely through Dar al-Islam. And some parts of Dar al-Islam, this is actually going to be the first writing system that's ever adopted for the spoken language in those parts of the world. So in West Africa, East Africa, the Arabic written language becomes very predominant as well. So, now once again, Dar al-Islam, you can see all across Dar al-Islam, some major trading cities emerge and grow and intensify in their importance as a result of their connection to Dar al-Islam. So a couple of big centers of trade to be aware of, though. Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid dynasty. And after it was really established in the 7 and 800 CE, this became probably the biggest city in the Middle East, and easily the most important city for trade and cultural purposes. But Mecca continued to be important as a center for trade and as the focal point of the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that drew people in from all over Dar al-Islam. But on the edges, though, other cities emerged too, like Timbuktu and Gao in West Africa. The Swahili coast cities of East Africa, like Mogadishu, Mombasa, they become very important. Malacca. And in all of these communities, then, you see Islamic merchants becoming more and more numerous and establishing their own diasporic communities. Now, along the Silk Road, especially, Islam spread through Persia, and by the mid-700s, it was already spreading across this border into western China. And along the Silk Road, in these major cities, like Kashgar and Dunhuang, these were areas that had been predominantly Buddhist. During the classical era, Islam starts to replace it as the religion that really sort of is the most prominent and that merchants along the Silk Road really support to the greatest extent. So actually now, in modern-day China, the Uyghur people and other sort of Turkic peoples descended from the nomads of the steppe here in western China were predominantly Muslim. Now, one other date to be aware of, though, 751 CE. This is going to be the biggest direct confrontation between Chinese civilization and Islamic civilization. When the Abbasid Caliphate, their armies meet the armies of the Tang dynasty right along a river there, and they're victorious. And this is actually going to be the furthest extent of both civilizations in these directions. Now, as a result of this battle, actually, this is when paper, which up to this point had been a closely guarded secret, how to make paper in China, actually now falls into the hands of Arab soldiers, and that knowledge begins to spread like wildfire across Dar al-Islam. So, continuing along. Now, as it goes along the Silk Road, once again, Islam starts to replace Buddhism as the primary religion. So in Afghanistan, beautiful mosques are built, right alongside Buddhist temples. And in China, of course, in areas where there were diasporic communities of Muslim merchants in China, you see mosques being constructed there in a Chinese style, but still for this new religion. And one important thing to be aware of is that Islam never became the majority religion in China, not even close. China was still predominantly a civilization influenced by Buddhism and especially Confucianism, but Islam did have a presence in these cosmopolitan cities that brought in merchants from all over Afro-Eurasia. Now, along with merchants, there was another sort of set of people who were helping to spread Islam across Dar al-Islam. And now, rather than merchant activity, you have scholarship and religious study as the basis for these connections. So another class of people emerges in Dar al-Islam called ulama. And these are people who are scholars of the Quran, the scripture of Islam, and are scholars of what are known as hadiths. The hadiths are not the Quran. They're not the word of God in Islamic tradition. Instead, these are collections of sayings and actions that are attributed to Muhammad himself, that were thought to be or to have been collected by his followers while Muhammad was alive. Now, the hadiths, there's a lot of debate, and there has been a lot of debate, for 1,300 years now, about which hadiths are legitimate, which are forgeries, which ones are really the best example of Muhammad's actual wisdom, and which can you discard. But the ulama, though, emerged as this new class of people who were very, very, focused on understanding the Quran, teaching it properly to other people, and also determining which hadiths should be followed, and how to interpret them, and what influence that should have on people's behavior. And you're going to see that Islamic rulers, so the caliphs and sultans, they started to recruit ulama as essentially legal scholars, helping them to figure out what the proper application of Sharia law would be. Because basically, if you want to have law based on the Quran, you need people who know the Quran and can help you figure out what those laws should be. So that's where ulama fit into this equation. Now, ulama, though, started to communicate widely. And just like merchants moving across Dar al-Islam, ulama moved from place to place to meet with other ulama, to debate, to trade ideas. And the schools, the actual places where ulama met with each other, and then where they taught students and transmitted their ideas to students, were called madrasas, or schools. So these madrasas also appeared alongside diasporic merchant communities all across Dar al-Islam. And these became major centers for the spread of Islam and the discussion of Islam in kind of a legal sense. Like, how do we really understand exactly what we should be doing in order to be good Muslims? So, and you can kind of think about ulama as similar to rabbis in Jewish tradition. That in Jewish communities, rabbis are not clergymen. They're not priests like in the Catholic Church. Instead, they are religious scholars who are thought to be the ones who really understand God's laws and can teach it to others. Ulama have the same kind of status within Islamic communities. So, now, in East Africa, over here, the Swahili coast, and in West Africa, over here, in Mali, along the Sahel at the bottom of the Sahara Desert here, Islam spreads into these areas through merchant activity, across the water into East Africa, across the desert by camel caravan into West Africa. But these are also going to be places that become very well known as being scholarly centers. And there will be cities like Timbuktu that become really kind of great focal points for ulama to congregate. And they'll have enormous libraries full of books of scholarship and discussion about the true nature of Islam and how to interpret the Quran and so on. Now, what starts to happen, though, is that in West Africa and East Africa, elites and merchants tend to be the ones who become Muslim. And you're going to see that outside of the cities, there's not as much penetration of Islam into just sort of average society. And the farther south you go in West Africa, or the farther west you go in East Africa and get more inland, where you don't have the same direct contact with Islamic scholars and merchants, you're going to see more traditional religions and ways of doing things. Now, you're going to see as well that because of the sort of unique cultural traditions that already existed in these areas, the Islam that emerges in West Africa and East Africa will be slightly different. So in particular, West Africa was a place where women had a great deal of social influence and even political power. And you're going to see that like travelers from North Africa and the Middle East are sometimes going to be shocked by how much freedom women are given in West Africa and just how present they are in everyday life. So now, we mentioned the example of Timbuktu as a great city that became a focal point of scholarship and activity for ulamas. And all of these cities really along the Sahel, so at the southern edge of the Sahara Desert where, your caravan basically has to stop as soon as it gets out of the desert, these became the great meeting points for trade and scholarship. And of course, Mansa Musa, the king of Mali in the 1300s, he was the one who was famous for his, really glitzy Hajj to Mecca. Now, this represented a few different things. First of all, the sheer wealth of the kingdom of Mali, because he's the one who brought, tons and tons of gold with him that he spilled everywhere along the way. He built schools, he built madrasas, he built mosques. But this once again shows you just how far-reaching Islam is becoming and how just big and diverse Dar al-Islam has become. That Mali, thousands of miles away from Mecca and months of travel, this is a place where people are getting up and going on their Hajj in order to go join the rest of Dar al-Islam in coming together at the city of Mecca. Now, another religious group that emerges as a kind of vector by which Islam travels are the Sufis. So, the Sufis are kind of, in some ways, the opposite of the ulama. The ulama were focused on studying the Quran very intensely, studying the hadiths very intensely, and understanding here is what God wants us to do based on the words of the Quran. Sufis are more mystical, and you're going to see that Sufism will be one of the great ways that Islam spreads outside of the original boundaries of Islam. And you're going to see that Sufism, in some cases, will focus less on studying the Quran and focus more on just experiencing a connection with God and opening yourself up, opening your mind and your heart in order to be inhabited by God. And in fact, some Sufi schools use this as their symbol, a heart, a human heart, with the word Allah, or God, inscribed upon it, because they were literally trying to love God beyond just understanding the Quran. So to Sufis, just going through the motions of being a good Muslim was not really satisfying or enough for them. And they wanted to do special rituals and practices like dancing in a way that put them in a trance, or special chanting, or performing special types of music or poetry that kind of put them in an altered state of consciousness in order to create a sort of heightened and more direct connection to God. So, all across Dar al-Islam then, Sufi schools will be established. And this is kind of the closest thing that Islam has to monasteries. Sufis won't be isolated, but they will be sort of communities of like-minded people who are extremely devoted to fulfilling this kind of religious purpose. Now, Sufis will also be very heavily involved in missionary activity. So Sufis will be some of the earliest people who bring Islam to parts of the Byzantine Empire, to West Africa, to India, to Southeast Asia. Sufis will be kind of the tip of the spear. Now, in some cases, those Sufis will be accepted by mainstream Islamic society, and sometimes will get along with ulama as kind of just, like a complementary version of Islam you can do, along with being a good Muslim according to the Quran. But in some cases, there will be clashes, and Sufis will sometimes actually be persecuted, depending on just what the local authorities really sort of feel about them. So, now, one particular Sufi poet to be aware of, though, probably the single most famous Sufi poet, is named Rumi. He was from Persia in the 13th century. He actually is one of the best-selling poets in the Western world right now. So if you go on like Amazon, it's just like the best-selling books of poetry, Rumi's probably going to be up there. And he writes very extensively about this idea of just kind of falling in love with God, beyond the boundaries of just like normal day-to-day religion. So, now as Dar al-Islam grew, you don't need to remember every single thing on this list, but kind of like trade in general, when we talked about the trade networks that crossed Afro-Eurasia, as Dar al-Islam grew, it intensified the amount of trade. It made it easier to move and to interact and to really sort of do business across great distances. So you're going to see that Dar al-Islam will be a great vector by which all sorts of things diffuse and come together and spread. So in the Middle East, Greek science and mathematics and philosophy and medicine had taken root there during the classical era, after Alexander conquered the Persian Empire. And for hundreds of years, even after the creation of Islam, you're going to see that Arab scholars and scientists and mathematicians will just continue developing these ideas. And that will be the great sort of crucible where some really important new mathematical ideas and scientific ideas will be developed. So things like, Arabic numerals are adapted from Indian numerals. Algebra will be invented there, which makes it easier to do things like accounting and, tax collection and scientific experimentation. So optics really advances in the Arab world. So the science of light and lenses. So actually, like corrective lenses, like glasses, are invented in the Middle East. Geometry and trigonometry take big leaps, which makes architecture more effective. The first inoculations against disease to try and prevent diseases are understood in the Arab world. Now, new agricultural knowledge and technologies spread, in particular qanat, which we'll illustrate in a moment. But sugar and coffee become really widespread across across Dar al-Islam. Now, some new and some old art and music and architectural styles, we'll illustrate these in a moment. And other ideas and technologies also make their way through Dar al-Islam very quickly because of how just connected, and sort of mixed this world is. So, now, one particular area where you see a lot of different things sort of coming together is in Spain, which, when it was ruled by Muslims, was called Al-Andalus. So the Umayyad dynasty had conquered Spain in the 700s, and for a few hundred years it remained under Islamic control, predominantly. But there was already a big Christian community there, there were already a lot of Jews living there. So this actually became one of the most sort of tolerant and religiously diverse and open places, probably in the world at this point. And as a result, you see, it becomes really sort of open to scientific inquiry, philosophical inquiry, and it becomes a major focal point where a lot of the new scientific ideas and philosophical ideas of this time period emerge. Now, eventually, though, Spain would, of course, be reconquered by Roman Catholic forces from northern Spain and Portugal, who eventually swept down and, drove out Muslims and Jews from this area by 1492. Now, sugar cultivation, of course, began in India, spread across Dar al-Islam, and became much more widespread. The qanat. This is a unique thing that was invented in Persia, and it's essentially an underground aqueduct. So you would basically sort of look for water underneath a hill or a mountain, and then you would dig a very sort of gradual aqueduct, not above the ground, but underground, in order to access that water and let it flow out to the land around the hill. So this was a way of just increasing the amount of fresh water available and the amount of land that could be cultivated and the amount of water that could be used in towns and cities for decorative purposes, for sewage and drinking water, and so on. Now, another artistic style that spread across Dar al-Islam is miniature painting. And this is a painting style that began in Persia. And this is the style where, you can see that people who are holy are depicted as having fire radiating from their head. And this kind of like fire around the head is actually derived from the Zoroastrian belief in fire as kind of a holy and purifying substance. So this is an example, actually, of Zoroastrianism kind of lingering and having an impact on this new religion that started to become dominant in Persia. So the idea of fire as kind of a purifying and holy thing continued to exist. So just a few examples of Persian miniature painting. And you can, pause on any of these to take a closer look if you want. But really colorful, really dramatic, just kind of fun to look at. This style became really common everywhere across Dar al-Islam. North Africa, the Middle East, India, and of course rugs and carpets from Persia. As the simple act of praying became more and more important in Islam, having a clean rug, a beautiful rug to pray on, was important. Now, another unique sort of artistic style that emerges in Dar al-Islam is called Arabesque. And the unique thing about Arabesque is that if you look closely, you have repeated patterns or tessellations in kind of like geometric patterns, floral patterns. This is something that became extremely popular in home decorations and decorating mosques and palaces all across the Arab and Islamic world. So, now because the words of the Quran were considered to be the words of God, the actual act of writing Arabic words from the Quran became an art form in itself and became an act of devotion. So calligraphy became a very highly valued art as well, just beautiful artistic writing of words from the Quran. And here's a combination of the two. Now, in Islamic cities, mosques quite often became the real sort of centerpieces of the cities. So kind of like in Europe, when we talk about Gothic cathedrals dominating the cities of Western Europe in the late Middle Ages, mosques start to pop up that really sort of dominate the skyline of Islamic cities. And these are places where people would go to worship, to pray. They became sort of community centers and centers of scholarship. But mosques traditionally had these big towers around them called minarets. And what these are is that when it's time to pray in an Islamic neighborhood, a man called a muezzin would go up to the top of these minarets and just call out to the surrounding neighborhood, hey, it's time to pray, and it would actually lead them in reciting the prayers at that moment. So once again, this is another example of creating a sort of community bond through the act of devotion to Islam. So, just some really great examples of famous mosques. This one's in Constantinople. This is the tallest minaret in the world. I believe this is in Morocco. This is a famous minaret in Samarra, Iraq. This was built in the 900s CE. Careful on that spiral staircase. Now, one particularly important building, though, in Islam is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. This is not a mosque. This is not a Muslim house of worship. But it is a really good example of all of these sort of styles within Dar al-Islam coming together. So it is a dome, which obviously is derived from Roman and Byzantine style building, but it's got Arabesque, it's got calligraphy, just this really sort of vibrant, dynamic color. And what it actually is, it is a dome constructed over this rock right here. And in Islamic tradition, there's a story of Muhammad going to Jerusalem and getting lifted up to heaven, to visit God. And in this tradition, this is thought to be the rock that he actually got lifted up from. So, and also, some believe that this was also the rock where Abraham, was going to sacrifice his son before being stopped by God in Jewish tradition, Christian tradition, Islamic tradition. So this is a rock that has a pretty big amount of importance for people who are very, very devout Muslims. So, there's the underside of the dome. And as Islam spread into India, into North Africa, and really everywhere through Dar al-Islam, once again, these building styles spread. So in India, for example, this is a place where you see all of these styles coming together as well. So when Islamic forces take over northern India and create the Delhi Sultanate, they start building in a Middle Eastern Islamic style. And the Taj Mahal, a great masterpiece of Islamic Indian architecture from the 1500s. This was actually a tomb built to the wife of the King Shah Jahan of the Mughal dynasty, who we'll talk about much later on when the time comes. But this is, bringing the domes and the sort of arabesque and calligraphic style from the Middle East into a new place as Dar al-Islam grows. So, now, the one singular guy, though, who really kind of represents just how widespread Islam became and just how diversified it became was a fellow named Ibn Battuta. He's someone we'll talk about more in class. But he was a merchant from Morocco originally who, when he started to travel in order to do trade, he just kind of caught the bug and just really never stopped traveling. And for decades, for the rest of his life, he traveled for tens of thousands of miles and visited almost every part of Dar al-Islam. And everywhere he went, he wrote his impressions, what he thought of the people there, whether they were good Muslims, what he liked about them, what he didn't like. And as a result of his keeping these diaries and just writing so extensively, he gives us a really sort of great snapshot and glimpse of how, first of all, just how big Dar al-Islam was, and the things that brought people together across Dar al-Islam. What made Muslims the same across all of this? But he also really highlighted some of the differences as well, and things he thought people were doing wrong or doing right. So he's a really interesting figure for that reason. So, now, we're done. So test your knowledge, look over these words, and just try to remember as much as you can about them and why they're significant. So you can pause and take a look at these. And then here's a few essential questions to wrap up with to test your knowledge as well. So that's all for Chapter 11. I'll see you in class.